Building off my last video demonstrating emulation in Batocera, I decided to shift focus to Sony's PlayStation 2. This console has always been the white whale for emulation handhelds, with most devices under a certain price point just unable to achieve consistent success with it. Right off the bat, I will say that I've had pretty good success on the Win600. It's not perfect, it's not going to run every game from the PS2 library, but then again, the PS2 library is massive, featuring over 4,000 games across multiple regions. For this video, I've tested an enormous number of games totaling over 50, and had about an 80% success rate. Unfortunately, it's a drop in the bucket when compared to the PS2 library, but the reality is even if 50% of the PS2 library is playable with good performance, that is quite a selection to choose from. So with that being said, let's take a closer look at the games I've tested in PCSX2. I recommend grabbing your favorite beverage, a couple snacks or two, because this one's gonna be a long one. I'm Rob, and thanks for tuning in to the Retro Tech Dad channel. For this video, because of the enormous number of games I've tested, I've decided to break it down into several sections. First, I will list the games that were not acceptable or playable to me. This is a fairly small number, totaling only about 9 out of the 50 games. I tested both the NTSC and PAL versions of these games. I found them to have various performance issues ranging from playing at half speed or staying below the 50 or 60 frames per second threshold. So with that out of the way, I can now demonstrate to you some games that are running at native resolution, running the NTSC version. First up is a shmup that is surprisingly hard to run, Castle Shikigami 2. Now the PS2 was stacked when it came to shmups, and this one received a worldwide release on PS2. The game is running here at native resolution and stays locked at 60 frames per second regardless of the action on screen. Continuing with shmups, and one of my personal favorites is the Japanese exclusive Ibara. This game comes to us from legendary shmup developer Cave and remains an exclusive to the PS2. Surprisingly difficult to run, this one does well at native res but requires OpenGL instead of the Vulkan API. The now defunct Incognito, who will appear again on this list, is responsible for this awesome downhill racing game featuring mountain bikes with over-the-top action, stunts, and combat. This one was always a favorite of mine back in the day and remains a blast to play with a unique premise. It remains the only entry and a PS2 exclusive. The game stays mostly locked at 60 frames per second at native res. For fans of the series, Futurama is a fun game with a cast we all know and love. It essentially plays like a lost episode of Futurama. It also is the only full-fledged Futurama video game, despite getting some typical mobile fodder many years later. It remains a relic of the 6th generation consoles. The NTSC version stays mostly locked at 60 frames per second at native res, and it looks pretty nice because of its art style.
So here's this giant enemy crab.
Before there were giant enemy crabs, there was the original Genji Dawn of the Samurai on PS2. This one plays very much like a Devil May Cry or Shinobi type game. It's a very solid action game that is very much overlooked nowadays by far more popular games on the PS2. It's very solid looking graphically despite needing to run in native res to achieve 60 frames per second here. This one is an interesting entry based on a graphic novel of the same name. The game began life as part of the now defunct Acclaim Studios. It's a combination based shooter and beat 'em up with a pretty cool story. This one got a digital only port to PSP and iOS. This is another one that runs well at native res, staying mostly locked at 60 frames per second. Sky Odyssey was a launch game on the PlayStation 2, and certainly its graphics show that. However, it's a lot of fun and is sort of inspired by games like Pilot Wings, but in many ways this is much more fleshed out. It was definitely a standout in the launch library of the PS2, and I really wanted to give this one a nod. Despite its simple graphics, this one needs native res to achieve 60 frames per second on the Win600. Tales of Legendia is another entry in the very popular Tales of series from Namco. If you aren't already familiar, it is an action-style RPG with full-blown voice acting and great graphics. I'll be honest and say it's not my favorite in the franchise. Strangely, this one did not receive a European release, and it also remains a PS2 exclusive. As you can see, the game does run well here, running at native res. Before Red Dead Redemption, there was Red Dead Revolver. I personally find this game to be rough around the edges compared to its successors. However, I still wanted to test this one out in emulation. The game runs really well at native res and NTSC, but is also pretty stable at 2x resolution in the PAL format, in case you wanted some cleaner visuals. Armored Core 3 came to us as a request from Bamcorp Gaming and is one of the many entries in the Armored Core series. Armored Core 3 is considered the pinnacle of the series to many, offering the perfect balance of content, gameplay, and difficulty. The series was very well represented on the PS2. This one required some very specific tweaking to get it running as you see here. It is the only game I tested that ran better in software mode, and the PAL version actually offered worse performance than the NTSC version here. I did enable a small FPS boost of about 5% to help keep it at that 60 frames per second target. Other than that, this one is very fun and does very well on the Win after some tweaking. And finally, the last of the games that I tested that needs to run in native resolution, the sequel to the immensely popular Kingdom Hearts. The second game was requested by a commenter on my last video, and so I am happy to report that it does run well at native resolution, staying locked at 60 frames per second. This is one that could almost run at 2x the res, but I opted for a stable experience. Despite this, the game's art style really carries it, and it still looks great here. Now we can move on to games that perform decently at 2x resolution using the NTSC versions. Shmups are always a good place to start in emulation, and Homura is a Japanese PS2 exclusive that runs well and can stay consistently at 60 frames per second at 2x resolution. The cutscenes do drop to about 50 frames per second, but they are skippable and the actual gameplay is solid. Continuing with shmups, and one of my personal favorites across any platform is the PS2 exclusive Gradius V. Does everyone remember when Konami actually published high-quality games? Developed by legendary studio Treasure, Gradius V is an absolute visually stunning shooter that runs well at 2x res and looks so good because of it. Absolutely a must-play on the Win600. One last shmup for our list, and oddly enough, a game that never received a North American release, but our friends over in the PAL territories did get this one localized. Gigawing Generations was published by Taito and originally released for their Taito Type X arcade board. I believe this is another entry that never received a console release outside of the PlayStation 2. Regardless, this is one that can run at 2x res, so enjoy those tasty visual shmup fans. Konami. Did I mention that they used to publish great games? Well, here's another to add to the list. Contra Shattered Soldier is an absolute top-tier return to the series, playing in the 2D side-scrolling style the classic games were known for, except with the visual boost that only the PS2 could provide at the time. This is another one stuck on the PS2 console, and I believe received a PlayStation Network release for the PS3. I doubt we will see this one return anytime soon, so thankfully it runs very well here and at 2x resolution. As a bonus, I tested Neo Contra, and it also runs well at 2x res. GrimGrimoire is a very interesting entry on my list, and by far one of the more unique ones in terms of gameplay style. It is a real-time strategy game with the absolutely gorgeous art style that only Vanillaware of Princess Crown and Odin Sphere fame can provide. This one did get a remaster for PS4 and Switch, but only in Japan currently. Unfortunately, this game was a massive commercial failure, and the founder of Vanillaware had to actually take a personal loan of 20 million yen just to tide them over. Thankfully, they are still very much around and still making games. I believe this is the first fighter on my list, and an absolute classic. It doesn't matter if you play this at the arcades, on Dreamcast, or here on PS2, you were treated to a fantastic follow-up to the mashup fighting universe of Marvel and Capcom. I'm so excited that this game runs well at 2x res because despite using 2D sprites for the characters, the game actually uses a 2.5D style graphics in the background and for visual effects. The 2x res really helps clean it up and make this one a stunner on the Win600. It's not a PS2 exclusive and has appeared on a good number of platforms. Ape Escape 2 is the sequel to the original PlayStation game, featuring silly monkeys that you need to capture in various ways. I've always loved this franchise. It's hard to resist the goofiness in these games. Ape Escape 2 looks really awesome here on the Win600 with its 2x resolution. The only issue I found was that cutscene FMVs were in a low FPS, but they can be skipped. Otherwise, gameplay is very smooth. I really wish Sony would revisit this series, especially with the tech of the PlayStation 5. You would think that Rygar was trying to rip off God of War, but actually I'd say it's the other way around, as this one was released back in 2002. Based on the arcade game and featuring Greek and Roman mythology, this is a 3D take with awesome action-based gameplay. The shield makes for some cool gameplay mechanics, and if you are a fan of God of War style games, you should check this one out. It did receive a port to the Wii, which I don't think many people know about. Regardless, this game runs pretty well at 2x res and cleans up nicely. Another entry from Incognito, who really put out quality titles on the PS2. Now imagine a 3D version of Rampage, and you get yourself War of the Monsters. This is a 3D fighting game with fully 3D environments that can be traversed and destroyed. This is such a fun game that plays off the 1950s sci-fi films and obviously pays homage to Godzilla and the likes. This is definitely an overlooked cult classic and remains a PS2 exclusive that thankfully plays very well in emulation, running at 2x resolution. Yet again, Konami returns to this list. Konami, what happened to you? I digress. And our next game needs no introduction. Silent Hill 2 is the sequel to the original PlayStation classic, and in many ways, the sequel takes the crown from the original, improving on it in almost every way. Fantastic storytelling, visuals, and an incredible soundtrack, Silent Hill 2 is a great survival horror game that has unfortunately been mishandled in later ports, so the PS2 version tends to be the popular way to play this classic. The game does pretty well at 2x res, but if you prioritize performance, I'd say run it native just so that you can keep it locked at 60 frames per second. Capcom was another studio that was killing it during the PS2 generation, and Maximo was a brand new franchise from them based on their legendary Ghosts and Goblins. Maximo was a 3D action hack and slash game that really harkens back to a simpler time of just being a pure video game. The graphics, gameplay, and soundtrack are all top notch here. The game is still pretty much a PS2 exclusive with a PSN release on PS3, but I doubt Capcom will be returning to this series anytime soon. Thankfully, this game looks super sharp here at 2x resolution on the Win600. Another original entry for Sony, and comes to us from their Japan studio, and the same team responsible for Shadow of the Colossus. I feel like Shadow of the Colossus gets all the spotlight nowadays, but Ico was such an interesting game when it first released and still holds up really well. Very much a minimalist type of game that prioritizes its emphasis on the setting and its storytelling. This is really one of the standout games from the PS2 generation and remains a cult classic. It was released as part of a collection with Shadow of the Colossus on the PlayStation 3, but I'd say it's been long forgotten since then. And this is one that does pretty well at the 2x resolution. One of the weirder entries on this list that also received a surprise localization for the English-speaking market, Mr. Mosquito literally has you controlling a mosquito that lives in the house of the Yamada family. The mosquito must carry out specific tasks in order to suck blood from the family members. Not at all surprising, being a very early PS2 release, but the game does run very well at 2x resolution. Sony was another studio doing a lot of interesting things on the PS2, and Mark of Kri comes to us from their San Diego studio, who unfortunately are stuck making yearly MLB games. This one is such an interesting blend of graphic styles and gameplay elements featuring Polynesian culture. Gameplay is a combination of stealth using a Raven as a scout with very violent and graphic battles. It also makes interesting use of both analog sticks during fights. I'm really pleased that this one does so well at 2x resolution, and it really makes this game shine. Now, despite Tekken Tag not performing well, Tekken 5 is very much on the opposite end of that and runs incredibly well at 2x resolution. This one shouldn't need an introduction, being the 5th entry in the long-running Tekken series, which has remained a PlayStation staple for a long time. All of the familiar gameplay and characters are present here, and honestly, this is a great choice for fighting game fans. My love for Katamari is relentless, and I knew I had to test We Love Katamari on the PS2, which is the sequel to the surprise original hit. I promise you this will not be the last Katamari game to be discussed on my channel, as it is always a go-to game for me because of its addictive gameplay premise and silly but lovable cast of characters. I wasn't all that surprised that this one was going to run well, and does mostly keep 60 frames per second at 2x resolution. However, if you prefer an absolutely stable experience, then native is probably the safer bet. Finally, we're going to shift to games that performed better using their PAL counterparts running at 50 frames per second. These were games that were mostly holding around 50 frames in the NTSC format, so I thought it was worth a try to check out their European counterparts to help stabilize the frame rate. Starting things off here is another franchise I absolutely adore, and Burnout Revenge is really when the series was hitting its peak point. Unfortunately, Burnout 3 was very close to that playable frame rate, but I'm glad that at least Burnout Revenge does a better job. However, it really is pushing the limits of the emulation here, which is why I opted for the PAL version. It's not perfect, but pretty playable, especially if you are a little more tolerant. Sony is back yet again with a new franchise and series that actually got its start on the legendary PS2. Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus is the first game in the series and certainly smaller in focus, but in many ways, I really love the original. The game has such a great cast of characters and the visual style is top notch. It looks really great even at native res and does stay pretty close to its FPS target. Kind of an obscure 3D platformer, and one I thought would be fun to feature and test, Kaya Dark Lineage was developed by Eden Games, better known for their expertise in racing games such as V-Rally, Test Drive, and more recently, Gear Club. Kaya was certainly a departure for them, but personally a worthwhile experiment. I think platformer fans will enjoy this one with its colorful visuals, but recognize it may not be as tight as other platformers of the time. This one's a little bit tricky to get running consistently, but it does okay in native res using the PAL version. Unfortunately, it does have its share of dips that may be unacceptable for some less tolerant. A sequel to the iconic Wipeout series from the PlayStation 1 era, this entry isn't my favorite in the franchise, but is exclusive to the PlayStation 2. This is one that needed a little help with the PAL version to help keep it at the stable 50 frames per second. Unfortunately, this one still has some dips in frame rate, though not as bad as our previous entry. Overall, it's certainly playable and might benefit from a small FPS boost or frame skip if you are tolerant of that. And Incognito is back on the list yet again with their reboot of the Twisted Metal series featuring David Jaffe back at the helm as director. The series started very strong on PS1 and then faltered when it changed hands to 989 Studios. Black was a return to form for the franchise, and it was a success both critically and financially. This one was made available on the PlayStation 4 through the PlayStation Network. This game is another that receives a little help from running the PAL version to keep its frame rate more stable. It also has occasional dips, but otherwise it's pretty playable. Gungrave is a highly stylized, anime-inspired third-person shooter game with character designs provided by the series creator of Trigun. In fact, the game was later translated into an actual anime series. I love this game mostly because of its awesome design and cool lead character, but this is just pure video gaming goodness, and you can just relax and blast away at the baddies. I believe this one is still exclusive to the PlayStation 2, but the franchise has seen a recent resurgence, and a brand new game is in development for the current gen consoles. It's another game that gets a little help from using the PAL version, but also suffers from occasional dips in frame rate, but still pretty playable at native res. Capcom is back on the list with another original entry and sort of inspired by their Clock Tower series. Haunting Ground is a survival horror game that I have quite a bit of fondness for, and like many cult classics goes for an obscene amount of money in the second-hand market. The main gameplay premise revolves around the dog that you can give orders to assist the main character. This one did okay with the NTSC version at native res, but I opted to see if the PAL version would help stabilize it further, and it definitely helped with that. I really recommend checking this one out. Knowing Capcom, we will probably never hear of this game again, and it is exclusive to the PS2. Kind of building off the prior entry, we have a third-person action horror game and another original game by Sony during the PlayStation 2 era. This one is kinda like Luigi's Mansion, but grown up, and yet has just the right amount of 6th gen jankiness to make this one pretty enjoyable. Sony didn't believe much in the series and actually left it for other publishers in North America and Japan. The game performed about the same in the NTSC version, but the PAL version helps stabilize the frame rate whenever the capture effect presents on screen. It's the only time the frame rate dips, and luckily it is at a point that doesn't impact gameplay. Otherwise, this one runs pretty well. Another Sony exclusive and original game, Rogue Galaxy comes to us from the RPG geniuses at Level 5 who built a reputation on the PS2 with their Dark Cloud series. I wanted to feature Rogue Galaxy since it was a much later release on PS2 and I feel like it's not as well known as Dark Cloud. The game has an awesome visual aesthetic which comes as no surprise from Level 5. I will say that this one really benefited from the PAL version and is now very stable running at the full 50 frames per second. Another Sony exclusive, and this one is kind of an interesting game. It is a game that features the likeness of Jet Li, who provided motion capture and voice acting work. It's basically like you're playing a Jet Li movie, and the gameplay is interesting using the right analog stick to carry out attacks. I really like this game, and I think it's a very underrated PlayStation 2 exclusive. This one is not perfect, and does suffer from frame rate dips, but the PAL version will definitely help with that a little bit. The sequel to the classic Parappa the Rapper series from PlayStation 1, this one was nowhere near as popular on PS2 both critically and financially. The game was practically unplayable using the NTSC version, and as the footage shows, it fares much better using the PAL release but still suffers from occasional drops. Otherwise, this one was interesting to check out, and like its reception, is not my favorite of the Parappa games. I feel like not many people know about this game, and it's a real shame. This one is kind of a sequel to NASCAR Rumble, another weird release back on the PlayStation 1, but Rumble Racing here for PlayStation 2 comes to us from Electronic Arts when they weren't afraid to experiment with a game or two. This one is such a blast of a racing game, and in more recent times reminds me of Blur, another very overlooked racing game. You can perform stunts to get boosts, pick up power-ups to take out enemies, and racing is fast and frantic. The PAL version helps stabilize the frame rate, which still has the occasional dip, but this one is definitely well worth checking out. If you like Blur, Mario Kart, then this one is a good one. On the very opposite end for racing comes the iconic simulation racer series Gran Turismo. This is the 4th entry in the franchise and an absolute beast of a game featuring tons of content. Naturally, I chose the Grand Canyon course to feature here since I kinda need to rep my current home state of Arizona. The PAL version helps stabilize the frame rate and it really does feel smooth and fast here. You can spend an eternity playing this game, and honestly, to me, the series really peaked on the PlayStation 2 and hasn't been the same since. Saving the popular YouTube benchmark game for PS2 emulation, here we have God of War running really well. I have tested this game as low as 12 watts and found that 15 watts is the ideal point to get the balance between battery and performance. However, as I always do, I prefer running this at 18 watts, which basically makes this a perfect experience using the PAL version and native res. And to build off that, I actually wanted to add in a bonus section discussing some TDP testing I did with PS2 emulation on the Win600. As you can see here on my chart, I did 3 configuration tests running at 18 watts, 15 watts, and 9 watts. 18 watts with full brightness and volume represents the worst case scenario and only yielded 1 hour and 15 minutes of battery life. 15 watts with 50% brightness and volume got about a 1 hour and 30 minute battery life, and the best case scenario that I got was 9 watts in Final Fantasy X at 50% brightness and volume, getting about 2 hours and 15 minutes. The reality is that the Win600 battery is just too small, and the Athlon Silver 3050e is just horribly inefficient. And on that note, I am excited to say that at the time of recording this last line of audio, I received my GPD XP Plus. So I will be taking a small break from the Win600 to check out a device that claims to have quite the battery life. Expect a video on it in the future, and I really do appreciate everyone that has commented and watched the videos here. I'm going to continue to expand my content, and I am looking forward to making more videos. Please comment down below and let me know what you think. This is the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.